Tonight, is Western media a shield for Israel's government and army?
I think the lack of condemnation comes down to politics and narratives. Reporting the human cost of Gaza challenges powerful interests, and journalists are often discredited for simply telling the truth.
Arab responsibility for the unresolved Palestinian question.
Mohammed bin Salman is in bed with Jared Kushner, and he's doesn't care about the Palestinian people. What have you heard Mohammed bin Salman say a single positive thing about the Palestinian people? He hates them for the same reason Abdel Fattah al-Sisi hates them, because they pose an Islamist threat.
And is lasting peace possible?
I don't see lasting peace happening anytime in my lifetime, and frankly, I don't see it happening anytime in the near future.
From Lisbon, Frontlines and Backrooms podcast. Your host, Vladimir Bobetic.
To understand why Gaza became permanent, we have to look at how Palestine was governed and abandoned. Palestine has been ruled by empires before. Israelites, Romans, Ottomans. History here is long and layered. But the political structures that still shape Gaza today were not built in ancient times. They were built in the 20th century. After the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, Palestine was placed under British rule through the League of Nations mandate system. Britain governed the land without sovereignty, promised the same territory to different peoples, and avoided responsibility for the consequences. Borders were drawn without consent. Institutions were built without accountability, and when violence escalated, Britons withdrew, leaving behind unresolved claims, competing national projects, and the population with no state. The effects of that period did not disappear in 1948. They shaped how Gaza was governed, isolated, and eventually managed as a problem rather than resolved as a political question. We began with Professor Benny Morris.
Well, on the face of things, the British government was in charge of Palestine down to May 1948. In other words, for the first half of the war between the Palestinian Arabs and the Jewish community in Palestine, the British were de facto and de jure at least the rulers of the land. And what happened there in some way was their fault. But really, this is silly because the British were leaving. They announced they were leaving from February 1947. They said, we're going to leave. They handed the problem over to the United Nations. The United Nations proposed a partition plan, which the Arabs refused and the Jews accepted. And then the Arabs launched the war, the Palestinian Arabs. So it's the launching of the war had nothing to do with the British. That was all the Palestinian Arabs and the Arab states doing. They launched the war. They started the war, which turned out as a disaster for the Palestinians and subsequently for the Arab states themselves. You can say that the British supported the Zionist venture and eventually the Zionist ambition of establishing a state in Palestine from the Balfour Declaration of 1917, November 1917. And the British did physically, materially, politically in various ways support the Zionist enterprise from 1917 until 1937-38, until the middle of the Arab revolt against the British. The Arabs of Palestine revolted against the British in 1936 in a rebellion that lasted until 1939. As a result of the Arab rebellion in 1936, and as a result of the clouds of war looming over Europe from the mid-1930s with Hitler and Mussolini, and in the Far East, the Japanese threatening British rule and possessions, the British decided in 1937-38 to switch tack, to stop supporting Zionism and to support the Arabs. Why support the Arabs? Not that they liked the Palestinian Arabs at all. The Palestinians just started a rebellion against them. But they feared that going into war on three fronts, against the Italians in the Mediterranean, against the Germans in Europe, against the Japanese in the Far East, it was best that their lines of communication be secured from Britain through the Suez Canal, through Iraq to India, Singapore, and so on. And therefore, they said we must have the Arabs on our side and at least neutral. So we mustn't crush the Arab rebellion too severely, 1937-38, and we must politically withdraw our support from the Zionists and give it to the Arabs. And if you like, this was a part of their appeasement policy. But in addition to appeasing Hitler and the Japanese and the Italians during the late 30s, they now started appeasing the Arabs as well. They knew that the Jews, they had committed themselves to support the Jews and a Jewish state. The Jews they knew were being persecuted in Europe, and the Holocaust loomed, though that they didn't necessarily know from Germany. But they decided to throw their weight behind the Arabs for strictly British interests, British political interests, and that's what they did. So what you can say in terms of the British is they supported Zionism in various ways from 1917 until 1937-38 in Palestine. But then in 1938-39, they switched to support of the Arabs. So you cannot say that the British supported the Jews from 1938 through the war of 1948. They didn't. They basically supported the Arabs politically and even in some ways militarily. They armed the Egyptian army, they trained the Egyptian army, they armed the Iraqi army, they trained the Iraqi army, and of course they led even the Jordanian army, which was the best army fighting in the 48 war, and armed it. Certainly they weren't pro-Zionist, and when it came to the vote in the United Nations in November 1947, they abstained. They didn't vote for a Jewish state, and they didn't vote against the Jewish state, because America, of course, supported the Jewish state, and they didn't want to antagonize Washington. But they turned anti-Zionist, basically, and adopted a policy of neutrality. To say that the British supported the Zionist side is wrong, certainly after 1938. One last thing should be remembered. The Zionists thought the British were against them, and felt that the British were hampering the Zionist enterprise almost from the beginning, from 1917 onwards. They thought the British were not really friendly, and many of their local officials and the military were against the Jews in Palestine during the mandate, even though the British government in London supported, as I say, the Zionist enterprise during those first 2 decades of British rule. And in 1948, the Jews felt, the Israeli government felt that the British were actually actively supporting the Arabs in the war. This was mistaken, but largely mistaken. But that's how the Jews saw it. In other words, it was sort of a mirror image of how the Arabs saw the British. Both sides thought that the British were against them.
After 1948, Gaza did not become part of a Palestine state. It came under Egyptian control, a period that left lasting consequences. Professor Foster, Gaza was under Egyptian control between 1948 and 1967, a period often treated as a historical footnote. How formative was that period, and which legacies from those years still matter today?
Well, the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, founded in 1963 by it was founded in Egypt. That's not a coincidence, because you had all these Palestinian resistance leaders in Gaza, and many of them, like Yasser Arafat and many others, they were carrying out these resistance operations from the Gaza Strip, where they were based in the early 50s. They were pushed out of Gaza. Many of them wound up in the Gulf, like Ahmed Shuqairi, and as well as Yasser Arafat, and a number of other PLO leaders wound up in Kuwait and the Gulf when they were expelled from Gaza, and they wound up in the Gulf, and that's where they founded Fatah. So it was actually during this period where all the major, most of the major, let's call them Palestinian political organizations and institutions were founded. So it's a very, very formative period of development for Palestinian national liberation. You also, I would say, had a very important moment in 1956 in which Israel, together with Britain and France, invade Egypt by force in a kind of neo-colonial war in which Britain and France want to reoccupy the Suez Canal because Gamal Abdel Nasser had nationalized it, and That was unacceptable to those colonial powers, or let's say former colonial powers. Israel, on the other hand, they wanted to conquer the Gaza Strip because they wanted to empty it of its refugees. And so in October 1956, the Israeli government invades Gaza and they occupy Gaza for about 5 months. The first invasion and occupation of Gaza, in which they try to, wait for it, empty Gaza of its inhabitants. They tried to do it in 1956 during the war itself, and they actually succeeded in pushing out about 1,000 Palestinians. They carry out 2 massacres. They carry out one massacre in Khan Yunis. They round up all the men above the age of 15, line them up in the city center of Khan Yunis, and execute them. It was a massacre. And they do the same thing in Rafah. They kill about 200 Palestinians in Khan Yunis, another 110 or so in Rafah. Those are UN figures. And they try and the hope is that by the massacres will scare the population into leaving. By the way, that's exactly what they did in 48. But 56 wasn't 48. The Palestinians understood what the plan was. They just 7 years early had literally been uprooted once. They weren't planning on leaving again. But this foreshadowed what was to happen. And then during those 5 months, the Israeli government, led by David Ben-Gurion, I believe at the time, he establishes a committee that is exploring proposals to how to empty Gaza of its Palestinian refugees. And then in 67, they do the same thing. And then in 2023, they do the same thing. So there's a long pattern of Israel trying to push Palestinians out of Palestine, because remember, like we said, Gaza is 80% refugees. And the refugees are this constant source of anxiety for Israel, not just because they are angry and they've been because they've been uprooted, and Israel knows why they're angry, because Israel stole their land and their property and made them penniless and landless, but because Israel knows they want to come home. And what could be worse than millions of Palestinian refugees returning home? That would destroy, in Israel's view, Israel's Jewish character. It would no longer be a majority Jewish country if you have all these millions of Palestinians coming home. So for Israel, that's existential. So it's trying to push them, get them out of Gaza, push them as far away as possible. So no, it's a very formative period. Not just because, like we said, you have all these resistance leaders and you have all these major Palestinian political organizations, which really have their roots in Gaza during that period, but also because it's foreshadowing this long trend of Israel trying to push Palestinians out of Palestine.
And after 1967, was there ever a real historical window for a reintegration between Gaza and the West Bank? Or was separation already becoming permanent?
Well, the Oslo process was supposed to sanctify the unity of Gaza and the West Bank. It's one territorial entity. And the Oslo process acknowledged that. But of course, in reality, Oslo was the exact opposite. It was the beginning of the end of Gaza and the West Bank as a territorial entity. Because really even pre-Oslo, really already in the late 90s, in the early 1990s, in 1990, Israel required Palestinians in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip to obtain a permit in order to work inside Israel. Whereas before 1990, Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank could freely move between Gaza and the West Bank and Israel. They could move from Gaza to the West Bank. There were no restrictions in doing that. But beginning in 1990, that became harder. Now you had to apply for a permit. And so the permit regime was used as a weapon to ensure Palestinian acquiescence to Israeli domination. If you resisted, you would never get a permit. If you resisted, your parents and your children and your siblings and your friends and your family wouldn't get a permit either. So it was weaponized to control Palestinian life, to control Palestinian sources of income, and ultimately to prevent any kind of political entity, any kind of a political sovereignty for Palestinians. And if you look back at many of the agreements that were signed between various Palestinian factions between, let's say, the early 2000s and the present, many of them have attempted to try to bridge this divide, to try and unite the Palestinian factions. You had a number of agreements, the Cairo Accords and the Doha Accords, and even most recently in 2023, you had all Palestinian factions travel to Beijing and sign an agreement in which, again, they're trying to unify the fronts and trying to establish which has long been the struggle within Palestinian society and Palestinian politics, is unification. Is that because you have Israel and the United States trying to divide and rule the Palestinian people and trying to undermine Palestinian unity, going all the way back to the 1970s when they established these village committees to undermine the elected representatives who sat on the municipal council boards and who were the elected mayors of the Palestinian towns throughout the West Bank and Gaza Strip in the 1970s. Israel was unhappy that they were all supporting the PLO. Like 2/3 of the mayors elected in Palestinian towns and villages and cities in the West Bank and Gaza, about 2/3 of them in the 1974 and 1976 municipal elections, supported the PLO. And this was unacceptable to Israel. And so Israel propped up these village committees, Palestinians in rural areas who didn't like the PLO and were happy to accept Israeli weapons and Israeli money and authority and the ability to issue building permits. And they were happy with that. But the whole point of that effort was to divide and rule the Palestinian people. And eventually the village committees were completely forgotten because they turned into an arm of the Israeli security state. And at that point, they had lost all legitimacy and they just disintegrated into oblivion. And then the same thing happened in the 1980s when the Israeli government armed and supported and provided, sorry, not armed, but funded and supported the organization known as Al-Mujama al-Islami, the Islamic Collective, right? And this Islamic Collective in 1987 renamed itself Hamas. And just 5 years before it called itself Hamas, it was receiving funding and support from Israel. And in fact, you have as many Israeli officials who called Hamas a creation of Israel. Like that's their words. So but why did they do that? Again, to undermine the PLO, to divide Palestinian society, to fracture Palestinian politics, to make it harder, because it's always much, much harder to resist domination and occupation and apartheid if you're divided than if you're united. And that has been the primary Israeli strategy from the 1970s all the way to the present day, when, as we all know, Netanyahu and Smotrich speak openly about empowering and funding and arming Hamas to act as a counterweight to the Palestinian Authority so that you never have to negotiate with them, because who do you negotiate with? They're divided. They can't even themselves come into a unity government. And so who are we even to negotiate with? And so that has been Israel's excuse to divide and rule Palestinians for the past half century.
History explains how Gaza was shaped. Demography explains why the conflict keeps reproducing itself. Professor Morris, comparing Israel's society today with the Israel you wrote about in the 90s, politically, culturally, and demographically, what has changed the most, and how have those changes shaped your views today?
Well, I don't know if they've shaped my views, but my political views certainly, not my historical perception. Israel has changed since when I grew up here, and down, if you like, to the end of the 20th century. Israel was a fairly normal social democracy, albeit embattled and surrounded by Arab states which didn't like it. There was a gradual movement among the Arab states to accept Israel's existence. A peace treaty with Egypt in 1979, a peace treaty with Jordan in 1994, and most recently, if you like, the Abraham Accords in 2020. But the Arab world gradually became more fundamentalist, largely or in part at least as a result of the rise of extremist Islam and its success in Iran, but also in the Sunni Arab world, Islamism became very important, very strong. So this pressure also affected Israel. But more importantly, in terms of the changes in Israel, was the growth of fundamentalism, Jewish fundamentalism in Israel, and the demographic changes in Jewish Israeli society. What happened was that the religious people, the ultra-Orthodox, the national religious people who were the base for the settler movement in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, these had large numbers of children, usually 7, 8, 9, 10 children per family, as opposed to secular Ashkenazi Jews who lived inside Israel proper, didn't settle in the West Bank, who had 2 to 3 children per family. This demographic growth among the religious ultra-Orthodox and the regular Orthodox began to change Israeli society demographically and politically. And the right became stronger and stronger as a result, leading to Netanyahu's eventual premiership and repeated premierships, victories in the polls, and leading to the strengthening of the Israeli settler movement in the West Bank, um, um, all of which began to change Israeli society. Unfortunately, in this sense, Israel was a democracy. I'm saying unfortunately because democracy means one man, one vote. And if you have more ultra Orthodox and Orthodox children becoming voters at the age of 18, their political power will increase and they will support ultra right political positions, such as encouraging and strengthening the settler movement in the West Bank, which is an obstacle to peace, peacemaking with the Palestinians. Let me add, though, I don't think that's the major obstacle to peace with the Palestinians, hasn't ever been the major obstacle. The major obstacle is Palestinian resistance to the very existence of Jewish sovereignty in any part of Palestine, not just the West Bank, but in Israel proper. They don't want Israel to exist. They believe that Palestine belongs to the Arabs and belongs to the Muslims, and that the Jews are interlopers and robbers. That's how they see the Jews in their hearts, even if some of them are so-called moderates and say, well, we must make do with what is, and we must reach some sort of compromise. But in their hearts, they see the whole Zionist enterprise as some sort of a robber movement by Eastern European Jews who arrived here for some reason. They don't understand why, because they don't recognize Jewish history. Arafat always denied that the Jews were here, that the Jews had a temple in Jerusalem, and so on. They don't see it as a legitimate national movement. So I'm saying that's the major obstacle to peace in my view. But the second obstacle, and growingly, has been the growth of the settler enterprise in the West Bank, which deprives the future Palestinian state, if it ever came into being, of land, because the settlers take land, settle on land, expand their settlements, and so on, and growingly narrow the amount of land remaining for the Arabs for the establishment of a Palestinian Arab state.
In the West, two simplified narratives often dominate. One portrays Israel as a liberal democracy, the other treats Palestinian society as politically monolithic. The assumption is that Palestinians in the West Bank are represented by the Palestinian Authority and that Gaza is uniformly supportive of Hamas. Professor Foster, how accurate is that picture, and what have been the most significant political, social, and economic divergency between Gaza and the West Bank within Palestinian society?
Well, culturally, socially, Gaza and the West Bank are quite similar. You walk around Gaza City, you may as well be in Ramallah or Hebron, right? They have the same feel. It's the same cuisine. Of course, there are differences, but it's the same general culture, the same general political symbols, right? What divides Gaza and the West Bank was politics. And from 2007 onwards, the Gaza Strip was ruled by Hamas. Recall that in January 2006, you had elections, national legislative elections, and Hamas won a plurality of the vote. They won 44% of the vote to Fatah's 41%. And when they tried to take power, the reins of power in the Gaza Strip, the Israeli authorities and the United States collaborated to prop up and arm and fund Fatah militia, Fatah fighters in the Gaza Strip to prevent Hamas from taking power that they had won legitimately in a democratic election. That free and fair observers called it, that observers called it a free and fair election. And there was a plot to take Hamas out. And the reporting came out in Vanity Fair, and there's a great article in 2006, I believe, in which it was made very, very clear that this coup was an attempt to undermine the democratic will of the Palestinian people. And Hamas, in a mere few hours in June 2007, took power. And they took over power to prevent those US-backed and Israeli-backed Fatah forces from carrying out a coup. And so since June 2007, Hamas has ruled Gaza Strip. At the same time that Mahmoud Abbas and his Fatah government sitting in Ramallah have ruled the West Bank. And by rule, you have to understand what I mean here. I don't actually mean rule. I mean, do Israel's bidding in the West Bank. That is the best way to think about the Palestinian Authority government, the Fatah government led by Mahmoud Abbas in the West Bank, is that over the past 20 years, that government, which ostensibly has control in a civilian control in areas A and areas B of the West Bank. This is a legacy of the Oslo process from 1993, in which the Palestinians would get limited autonomy in certain parts of the West Bank and certain parts of Gaza. And that's exactly what was happening. But of course, over the past 30 years, Israel never gave Palestinians real control. Even from the earliest moments of Palestinian so-called sovereignty in the West Bank, in which you had PA forces ostensibly patrolling the streets, policing the streets, and collecting the trash, and issuing building permits, and managing the hospitals and the education and the and so ostensibly Palestinians had control over all these things. But over the same 30-year period, from 1993 to the present, Israeli forces, the Israeli military, both in uniform and in plain clothes, have entered areas A, B, and C, all areas of the West Bank, more or less, I would say, every week, if not nearly every day, for the past 30 years. So Palestinians have never had any real control. Today, if you ask yourself, what is the role of the West Bank? It is to lick. What is the role of the Palestinian Authority? It is to lick the boot of the Israeli military and do exactly as they're told. The Israeli military last week entered Tubas. And went in. This is Area A, right? This area the Palestinian Authority controls, that Mahmoud Abbas controls. The Israeli military entered, arrested 100 some Palestinians. They just a few weeks earlier they entered Tulkarm and literally went from shop to shop, grabbing Palestinians off the streets and abducted 1,500 Palestinians off the streets of Tulkarm. This is 3 weeks ago. They did the same thing in Jenin and Tulkarm and Nur al-Shams in January 2025 when they, in the middle of the night, entered the homes of 32,000 Palestinians and uprooted them and just expelled them from their homes for having committed the crime of being born a Palestinian refugee in the Jenin, Tulkarm, or Nur al-Shams refugee camps. So the Israeli army controls all aspects of Palestinian life in the West Bank. They have no control at all. But that is kind of the nature of the divide between Gaza and the West Bank today, or let's say on the eve of October 7th.
Professor Morris, when did Israeli society lose faith in the possibility of peace? Was there a specific turning point, and was October 7th one of them?
No, the 7th of October, I think, has been a decisive event. I think from that point on, I think even the left, the liberal center and the socialist or so-called socialist left have given up on the idea of a two-state solution. They don't believe it's ever going to happen because the Palestinians, as I just said, they understand this was the point driven home by the Hamas on the 7th of October, will not recognize Israel and will try to destroy Israel whenever they get a chance. This is how the Jews today in Israel see the Arabs. Now, this is certainly true from the 7th of October, but has been growingly true, and partly, as I say, as a result of Jewish demographic developments, has been growingly true since 1967. 1967, the Israeli occupation of the territories, West Bank, Gaza Strip, East Jerusalem, encouraged the growth of Arab resistance to Jews. The Jews saw this as terrorism. They call this resistance terrorism. And the growth of Arab terrorism, the killing here and there of Israelis by people wielding knives or machine guns or grenades, and this has been going on for the last 5 decades. This too persuaded many Jews that we can't talk to the Arabs. As from the Arab perspective, Israel crushing Palestinian resistance, which included a lot of killing, a lot of mass arrests, and so on, showed them that they have no partner in the Jews for peace either. There was a sort of a mutual thing here. But from the Jewish point of view, and that's what you were asking me about, growingly, I would say, from 67 and the growth of Arab terrorism or resistance, as they call it, to the Jews inside Israel and in the territories, this gradually persuaded a lot of Jews that we don't have a partner for peace here. The 7th of October clinched this.
If peace is no longer the objective, the question becomes how control is exercised. Professor Foster, some analysts describe Gaza as laboratory for Israeli policies of control. What is the strongest historical evidence for that view? And in your opinion, when did Gaza cease to function as typical occupied territory, especially given that international law places specific obligation on an occupying power?
Yes, that's correct. Um, the obligation of the occupying power is to provide for the population, right? They are responsible for the well-being of the health, the housing, food security. They're responsible for the well-being of the population. So if people are starving in occupied territory, that's the responsibility and the accountability on the occupier, not the occupied, right? So for every minute of every day of every year, from June 11th, 1967 to the present day, Israel has been occupying the Gaza Strip and the West Bank with no exceptions. There's never been 1 minute for the past 58 years in which Israel has not been occupying, despite Israel's claims. Right? Israel will tell you, oh, we left Gaza in 2005 during the disengagement plan. Well, what you did was you repositioned your soldiers. So rather than, for example, your soldiers being positioned inside the Gaza Strip. Now they're just positioned around the perimeter. It's much easier to control that way. Think of if you're controlling a prison and the prisoners are rowdy and there's prison riots all the time, and every once in a while one of your prison guards gets killed in one of these riots. Well, you don't want that to happen, so you just appoint 2 or 3 or 4 Palestinians that they can decide who goes into solitary confinement. They can decide how much food the prisoners get. They can decide who gets to go on a break, but you control the perimeter of the prison. No one leaves the prison. No one exits the prison. You decide how much food enters. You decide how much who gets to. So you control everything that happens in the prison. That's the perfect analogy for Gaza, because Israel controlled everything that happened in the Gaza Strip through its siege, right? You decide who enters, who exits. You decide how much food enters and exits. You control the airspace. You control the seacoast. You control the groundwater resources. You control the rainwater resources. So it's illegal to collect rainwater in the Gaza Strip on October 6, 2023, because that would be a violation. Because Israel is the sole owner of all the rainwater and all the groundwater and all the surface water and the seacoasts and the telecommunication networks and the population registry and all the border crossings. So Israel is in complete control of the Gaza Strip, save for one border controlled by Egypt. So Egypt's complicit here. But it's Israel that is the primary guilty party here, and that they're the occupier. So no, there has never been an end to the occupation, and it continues to the present day, when even that facade of giving up the occupation that Israel pursued after 2005 is gone. Right, 50% of the Gaza Strip today is being occupied with boots on the ground with Israeli soldiers.
Gaza has been largely destroyed in the West Bank. Attacks by the Israeli military and settlers continue alongside ongoing territorial expansion. Given these realities, how visible is the two-state solution at this point, and to what extent has it become less a political project and more a diplomatic performance for Western governments?
The two-state solution, as it's known, is a fig leaf. It's smoke and mirrors. Every day, Israeli settlement expansion increases. Every day, Israel entrenches its apartheid regime in the West Bank and its genocidal rule in the Gaza Strip. So, if you're talking about a two-state solution, while standing by Israel and continuing to supply it with weapons, continuing to provide it diplomatic cover, well, then it doesn't matter what you say. What you're doing is you're erasing Palestine off the map, is what you're doing. So the two-state solution the so-called two-state solution has been a distraction and continues to be a distraction. It's so cynical, because these leaders who talk about a two-state solution, while they talk about a two-state solution in front of the camera, if you just examine their actions, they're doing everything in their power to make a two-state solution impossible, right? What is a two-state solution? A two-state solution can only happen if the Palestinians have control of their own destiny, if they have real sovereignty. But what is happening in Gaza and the West Bank? You just had a UN Security Council resolution that enshrined U.S. ownership over Gaza. That's right, not even U.S. ownership, Donald Trump ownership over Gaza. That was just enshrined in a UN Security Council resolution that passed last week. So you're telling me you support a two-state solution while at the same time, Britain and France, Security Council resolution members who have a permanent veto power, and Russia and China and even Algeria and Pakistan and the whole Security Council just enshrined US control over Gaza while you're saying you want a two-state solution? I mean, you have to be schizophrenic to believe that.
One argument often made on the Israeli side is that Palestinians rejected statehood in 1947, 2000, and 2008. And I want to press this point. Those moments involved different historical contexts, different leaderships, and very different pressures. Professor Morris, to what extent can those past refusals reasonably be used as evidence that Palestinians today, especially younger generations, do not genuinely seek a sovereign state of their own?
Well, no, I don't say they don't want a sovereign state of their own. I say they don't want a sovereign state as part of a divided Palestine alongside a Jewish state. That's what they're resisting. Um, um, Listen, I think October 7th also has done things in Palestinian society, not just in the Gaza Strip, but the West Bank and in the Palestinian diaspora. And what it's done is, on the one hand, it's probably driven home the message that you cannot have a Jewish state next to a Palestinian state. All of Palestine must be us. The Jews are barbarians. They're busy killing tens of thousands of Gazan Arabs. We can't live alongside them. We can't divide Palestine. And I would say that some Palestinians also have learned from this the opposite, that perhaps Israel is too strong, that logic, reality demands that we reach an accommodation and compromise with them. I think that Palestinians probably are divided on this. Some being driven, if you like, to extremism, and one being driven to becoming agreeable to a compromise, even if reluctantly becoming agreeable to a compromise.
So, so let's make this very concretely, Professor. Do you think that Palestinians have a right to self-determination, to have a state next to the Israeli state?
Yeah, I've always believed that. I've always believed in a two-state solution, that the only solution which offers a modicum of justice to both peoples is a divided Palestine with a Jewish state and a Palestinian state next to it. That's the logical solution. That's what reason and, if you like, morality demand, in my view. But the problem is that there's sufficient numbers of Arabs and sufficient numbers of Israelis who resist this and don't see this as justice or moral.
Beyond Israel and Palestine, the regional response has been striking. Professor Foster, one of the striking features of this war has been the relative silence of the Arab states. Why have so many governments in the region acted largely as bystanders despite public anger and pressure?
Well, the first thing to say is that the people of the Arab world feel very, very differently about Palestine than the governments of the Arab world. Let's state that at the outset. But if we look at the governments, let's start with um, the most important Arab governments in the region, at least historically the most important ones. Let's say Egypt. Egypt has been completely co-opted by the United States. The Egyptian government receives a couple of billion a year, I believe 2.5 or so billion a year from the United States government in the form of military and economic assistance. That's critical. And Egypt is also deeply in debt and knows that if it decides to do anything the United States government doesn't like, that there will be no loan forgiveness, that the government will go bankrupt, the Egyptian people won't be able to afford bread, and there'll be mass riots. The government's enslaved owing to its debt obligations, and it needs United States military and economic support. So Egypt is, not to mention that Egypt is a military dictatorship run by Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, who has imprisoned 60,000 Muslim Brotherhood members sitting in Egypt's torture dungeons. And Egypt is just as anti-Hamas as Israel is, because Hamas is an outgrowth of the Muslim Brotherhood, and they don't like Islamicism, and so Egypt is very hostile to any kind of Islamist organization, including obviously Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad. So Egypt doesn't support the Palestinian people. They're complicit in the genocide. They've kept that border closed. They kept it closed when they could have opened it before May 2024. They could have opened it. And they did. I mean, it was open. Some people could leave. About 100,000 or so, maybe 150,000 Palestinians have left. But why not more? You could have saved literally hundreds of thousands of lives, and you didn't, because you don't want them in your country, because you see them as a fifth column, as a security threat. So that's Egypt. The United Arab Emirates, let's go to the Gulf. They're one of Israel's strongest supporters in the Abraham Accords, in which Israel signed what I wouldn't even call these normalization deals, because there was already normalization, unofficial, before the Abraham Accords. It became official. But what was the actual change? It wasn't normalization. It was arms transfers. The Abraham Accords was a weapons deal. It was a weapons deal wrapped around the language and propaganda of a peace deal. I mean, it's very dystopian, right? I mean, it's it's Orwellian. And so the UAE is desperate to get Israeli spy tech, right? They want Pegasus software. They wanted to monitor all the activists and all the political dissidents and all the opposition members within their country. So that's what the UAE was after. Same with Bahrain. Same with Morocco, and same with Sudan, the four countries that signed on to the Abraham Accords, all interested in Israeli spy tech and Israeli weapons. In fact, Israeli arms manufacturers sold about $12 billion of arms in 2024. 25% of those arms went to those four countries I just mentioned. 25% of Israel's arms exports are going to Arab countries. I mean, it's crazy, right? So they're in bed with the Israelis. I mean, where is there any opposition to Israel in the Arab world? Jordan? I mean, it's the same story as Egypt. They're a slave to the US. Saudi Arabia? Mohammed bin Salman is in bed with Jared Kushner. And he's doesn't care about the Palestinian people. What have you heard Mohammed bin Salman say a single positive thing about the Palestinian people? He hates them for the same reason Abdel Fattah al-Sisi hates them, because they pose an Islamicist threat. MBS wants to secularize Saudi Arabia, introduce, and I'm not saying all his reforms are bad. No, he's trying to liberalize, more access for women. They don't need their husband to open a bank account, etc. Those are good things. But he also has no desire to share power. He murdered Jamal Khashoggi in the Saudi embassy in Istanbul a few years ago. He launched a 10-year-long war against Yemen, in which he turned the country into rubble, destroying the country, impoverishing its people, starving millions. Literally millions of people starved because of Mohammed bin Salman. You're telling me this is a person who cares about the Palestinian people? No, his goal is to modernize the kingdom, quote unquote, to diversify the economy away from oil. He doesn't care about the Palestinian people. So where do you have any allies of the Palestinians in the Arab world? They're all either slaves of empire, they're uninterested in the Palestinian cause because it poses a threat to their own stability in their own regimes, or they just don't care about the Palestinian people. What else is there to say?
Professor Morris, in past interviews, you described this conflict as a clash of civilizations. You spoke of a confrontation between what you saw as a modern society and a more traditional or radical one. Do you still stand by that description today? And what did you mean by it at the time, historically and politically?
Yeah, I do think there is a clash of civilizations. Of course, I'm not the person who invented this and not the only person who believes this, but I do believe that the Islamic East has values which are contrary to what we call Western civilization, Western values, and that these civilizations, if you want to call it that, are inimical. They are fighting each other. The Muslims regard the West as encroaching on them and on their rights, with a military presence, with invasions, if you like, of Iraq and of Afghanistan, and so on over the decades. And the state of Israel itself, established in the midst of Arab and Muslim lands. But the West sees it differently. The West sees a Western civilization being assailed by Muslims and Arabs, especially Arab Muslims. The West is assailed by Arab and Muslim terrorism, is assailed, in my view, by enormous immigration from the Muslim and Arab world into their states, with large Muslim minorities in France and in Belgium and in Germany and in Britain and growingly even in America, and that these minorities are part, if you like, of a Muslim invasion of the West, which gradually will turn the West and large parts of the West into parts of the Islamic Ummah, Islamic lands. Bernard Lewis, a well-known historian, said that Western Europe is likely within 100 years to become Muslim. And he may be right, because of Muslim Arab birth rates and because of continuous immigration of Muslims, family relations and various other things, asylum claims will have an enormous Arab Muslim minority, which will gradually become an Arab Muslim majority, and that these Muslim communities do not integrate, do not become Western, they do not become westernized, they remain in some ways ideological and religious collectives, hostile to the environment which they've just come to settle among. It's very strange because they look to the West, they see the West as something which worth getting to. It doesn't have the civil wars, it doesn't have the poverty, lack of education, lack of health care, and so on, which exists in their lands where they come from. So they come to the West, but at the same time, they're trying to subvert the West from within. And externally, you've got terrorism and Arab attack on Western interests and people, including Israel. Israel is at the forefront, in this sense, of the West. It's a sort of a bastion of the West in the Arab world, in the middle of the Arab world. So you've got a two-pronged attack on the West in this class of civilization, as the West sees it, and as I generally see it as well.
Okay, Professor Morris, but according to the polling from Pennsylvania State University, which was conducted in May 2024, 82% of Israeli Jews supported the forced expulsion of Palestinians from Gaza. 47% support treating Gaza as Jericho. You know what that means, like killing all the inhabitants over there. 70% of secular Jews, liberal Jews, ones as you are, they support mass expulsions. 53% oppose humanitarian aid to enter Gaza. Do you think that this type of the wording or narrative, like clash of civilization, didn't influence these numbers and made them possible?
No, that's not what made the numbers possible. What made these numbers, which reflect a extremization of Jewish Israeli perceptions and views towards Palestinians possible, isn't the idea of clash of civilizations. It's the 7th of October, when the Hamas invaded southern Israel and slaughtered 1,200 Israelis, 850 of them men, women, and children who were civilians. This and the war which then followed, which also cost the lives of hundreds more of Israeli troops, this led many Israelis to become more extreme in their views and to begin supporting the expulsion of the Palestinian Arabs from the Gaza Strip, which has always festered as a center of terrorism against Israelis since the 1950s. It's not something which began on October 7th, 2023. It began in the 1950s, terrorism from the Gaza Strip by Palestinian Arabs against Israelis living in southern Israel. But I'm saying what happened on October 7th has turned Israelis into, at least momentarily, towards more extreme positions vis-a-vis the Arabs.
Professor, no one is denying the horrific crimes committed on the 7th of October, but the international community have an issue with current denial. Recent figures from Gaza suggest that tens of thousands of people, mainly women and children, and entire families are removed from a civil register. As a historian, does what we are witnessing meet the definition of genocide under international law?
I don't think so. I don't think it meets the definition of genocide. It doesn't matter what international law says. What matters is the dictionary. Look at the word genocide in a dictionary, every dictionary, and it means the destruction of a people, the desire to destroy a people, and the activation of a policy of destruction of a people. This isn't what happened in Gaza. There's been a war in which Hamas fighters hide behind civilians. Israelis try to kill these Hamas fighters, and because they're embedded among civilians, civilians die as well. You can say maybe Israel shouldn't have gone after every Hamasnik with bombs, etc. It could have been more discriminating, perhaps, but in general, there wasn't a possibility of discrimination because the Hamas fighters hid behind civilians, hid in schools, hid in mosques, hid in hospitals, under hospitals and tunnel systems, etc. And the only way to fight the Hamas, and was dictated by the Hamas, not by Israel, was actually to use large amounts of explosives, which inevitably killed also innocent civilians. It's a problem, but that's what happened. But this isn't genocide. And as you can see, the number, incidentally, of Arabs living in the Gaza Strip today is probably larger than it was on the 7th of October, 2023. Natural increase probably was greater than the number of Arabs who actually died in the war. Nobody's actually worked this out, but I assume that's the case. Genocide usually means, like in Europe during the Holocaust, or in Turkey during the Muslim destruction of the Christian communities in Turkey, the number of Christians in Turkey diminished by 95%. The number of Jews in Europe diminished by 70% or whatever, or 80%. During the Holocaust. The number of Arabs in the Gaza Strip didn't diminish. It's probably the same, or as I say, probably even higher today than it was at the beginning of the war. The word genocide doesn't apply at all.
Professor, you understand that people who are going to hear that number of people in Gaza increased during this war will think that you are saying a right-wing propaganda.
Why? No, I'm talking figures, facts and figures, not propaganda. Facts and figures. Genocide means to kill a people, to try and kill a people. This isn't what happened in Gaza Strip. We tried to kill as many Hamasniks as we could, and we ended up also killing tens of thousands of civilians, among whom they were embedded.
History, power, and ideology shape how wars are fought, but they also shape how wars are seen and who is allowed to tell the story. Nadina Malic-Begovic, reporter who witnessed Gaza before the last war. Nadina, I want to turn now to an issue that it is deeply important to both of us, and that's the fate of journalists in Gaza. More than 200 journalists have been killed since the start of this war. What does that tell us about how information is controlled in this conflict and about the risks faced by those trying to report from the ground? And why there is no more condemnation from journalistic community and organization about what is happening to the journalist in Gaza?
I think the lack of condemnation comes down to politics and narratives. Reporting the human cost of Gaza challenges powerful interests, and journalists are often discredited for simply telling the truth. There is also fear. States, organizations, and even media outlets hesitate to confront Israel directly. About a month ago, I did an interview for a local media in Bosnia with a journalist from Gaza. We talked about the double standards in Western media reporting and the constant pressure Palestinian journalists face while covering Gaza. What shocked me, and I didn't know this before, it was the level of mistrust that some international media have towards Palestinian journalists. Because the Israeli government prohibits foreign journalists from entering Gaza Strip, Western media outlets have no choice but to rely on local reporters. Even then, they demand additional sources and verification for every story. As this journalist explained, every word must be backed up by images. They risk their lives under the shelling just to be on the ground, and they are even asked to share their exact locations live to those media outlets. For me, this was horrifying. not only because of Israel's treatment of Palestinian journalists and the tendency to label them as a Hamas supporter or terrorist, but also because of how some Western media treat their colleagues who are risking everything simply to bring the truth to the world. For them, the situation is still unbearable. Even though there is a ceasefire on paper, people in Gaza are still being killed, and journalists are the ones documenting it. They film bodies still trapped under the rubble, the impossible conditions of daily life. Palestinian children killed, two of them were killed because crossing the yellow line yesterday. And after all that, they are supposed to go home, warm up with their families, take a breath, but they have no homes. That's the problem. Their houses are gone. Many have lost relatives, family members. Every day is reduced to pure survival. They are exhausted physically, emotionally, completely. And even under what is called a ceasefire, they remain targets. At least 200, uh, I need to check, 248 journalists have been killed so far, and those still alive work under the same constant danger. While reporting on the suffering of others, they must also figure out how to protect their own lives. A ceasefire means nothing if people are still dying. A ceasefire means nothing if our colleagues are still dying. Many journalists would have left Gaza earlier, but they couldn't abandon their families. Even now, some are still trying. For a long time, leaving wasn't even an option. And when it finally became possible, they had to pay a huge amount of money to Egyptian border guards, 5 to 7 thousand dollars per person for a family. That means at least 20,000. Most could only gather that money through crowdfunding organizations or crowdfunding organized by their relatives living abroad. Actually, some of the severely injured managed to leave that way. One media worker I stay in touch with told me he wants to leave too. He said it quietly, almost apologetically, as if he needed to justify wanting to survive. Actually, after years of suffering, after everything they have lived through, people feel guilty even for wanting safety or peace.
The battle over Gaza is not only fought on the ground, it is fought over language, law, and speech. Professor Foster, we live in a moment where criticism of the Israeli government, the IDF, or policies in Gaza and the West Bank is often labeled as anti Semitic. In some countries, people face legal or professional consequences for speech that would once have been protected, including calls for boycotts or slogans like "From the river to the sea." How did we reach a point where criticism of a foreign government is increasingly treated as a criminal or moral offensive?
It's quite remarkable. I can't recall anything like this happening in my lifetime, where around the United States, there are dozens and dozens of state laws forbidding citizens or residents of a given state from boycotting Israel. If they do boycott Israel, they're not able to receive state funding, not for boycotting the United States, for boycotting Israel. And the same was true of Mahmoud Khalil and Rumeyza Ozturk. What was the unforgivable crime they committed, which led both of them and dozens of other political prisoners to wind up in prison? Did they call for the violent overthrow of the United States government? No, they criticized Israel. So you're much more likely to face arrest, abduction, prison time in the UK, in Germany, in France, in the United States, in Argentina, and many, many other countries around the world if you criticize Israel. You're more likely to be a political prisoner in your own country for criticizing a foreign country than criticizing your own country. I mean, it's absolutely insane. Why is that? I mean, the Israel lobby in the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Argentina, Germany, and dozens of other countries around the world is incredibly powerful. And there are a million and one reasons why that is the case. And we don't really have the time to get into each of these individual cases. But I mean, just look at who has been in control of U.S. policy towards the Middle East for the past 3-4 decades. Like 90% of the people in the room, in the in the room at Oslo, at Camp David in 2000, at Annapolis in 2007, 8, and today all the way to the present day. Who's in the room? It's just Israel lobbyists. It's Zionists. Almost most of them Jewish. Not all. Many non-Jews. Mike Huckabee, Pete Hegseth are Christian Zionists, but they're all Zionists. I mean, Jared Kushner, Zionist. Steve Witkoff, Zionist. Not just like casual Zionists, like hardcore, diehard Zionists, like Likud Zionists, like right-wing fascists. And go back to the 90s, it was the same story. Bill Clinton's top advisors, who were they? Who helped manage the Oslo process? They were all Zionists, most of them Jewish Zionists. Why is that? How is it that the Zionists, especially the Jewish Zionists, but also Christian Zionists, have gotten so much power in the United States? I mean, we can speculate on how it is. We can speculate on how it is they came to dominate the media. Why it is that if you look down at all the CNN anchors and Jake Tapper and Wolf Blitzer, and how is it that they're all like Wolf Blitzer was a former AIPAC lobbyist and now he's a host on CNN? But look at the New York Times columnists. Steve, what's his name? These warmongers, Jewish Zionists. Thomas Friedman, Jewish Zionist. Go to the Washington Post. It's just a cutout for the CIA. They're all Zionists. All the major writers are just supporting the official security state position on Israel-Palestine, which is erase the Palestinians and ensure Israel has a right to self-defense. But go down at Fox News. It's even worse. Every major mainstream, and I'm focusing on the US now, but we could go to the UK and we could go to Germany and France and Argentina. It would be the same story.
After decades of war, displacement, and failed solutions, the question is no longer only how Gaza was shaped, but whether any future remains possible.
It's very hard to imagine a world in which a Palestinian state would come into existence ever, because all the forces, at least in the near future, are aligned against the Palestinian people. The Trump peace plan is a plan for the permanent US and Israeli control of the Gaza Strip, in which Palestinians are reduced to beggars who have to line up every day for a morsel of bread and a cup of water. And they will be enslaved in concentration camps that will be built by US contractors and US warmongers and US private security officers. And that's what looks like is in the works for the Gaza Strip. I mean, that's the point of the peace plan. I'm putting peace plan in quotes, obviously, but and then in the West Bank, it's just as bad. I mean, it's almost as bad, right? You have, I think, 1,000 Palestinians killed in the West Bank since October 7th, 2023. Dozens of Palestinian communities uprooted, ethnically cleansed throughout the West Bank, shepherding communities, mostly in Area C. Another 32,000 ethnically cleansed from the Jenin, Tul Qadam, and Nur Shams refugee camps. Ongoing settler violence in the South Hebron Hills, around the E1 zone near Ramallah, in the north of the West Bank, around Sebastia and Humsa. I mean, it's everywhere. You can't go. I think the latest statistics I saw were during the olive harvest season. You had about 70 documented attacks on Palestinians in the West Bank every day. 70 attacks per day. I mean, it's insane. So you're telling me there's going to be a Palestinian state built in this land, in the West Bank and Gaza, where Palestinians are just being slaughtered, imprisoned, abducted, murdered, maimed, without end. Where's the Palestinian? How do you build a Palestinian state out of a violent genocidal state that is doing everything in its power to erase all Palestinian existence, to just scorched earth policy? I mean, if you had to say that the Israeli policy in the 1980s and 1990s was this policy of disproportionate force, that's the Dahia doctrine, right? That if they kill one of us, we'll kill 100 of them, right? If there's an attack from a village, well, we'll just we'll occupy that village and we'll arrest everyone. So it was a disproportionate violence policy. But today that policy has changed. It's no longer disproportionality is the guiding principle. it's scorched earth is a guiding principle. Is if there's an attack from a village, we're just going to flatten the village and expel everyone, kill or expel everyone, and make human life and human existence impossible. And so it's moved from kind of an overarching policy of disproportionality to an overarching policy of scorched earth and genocide. And that's where we're at today. So no, I don't see a Palestinian state on the horizon.
I don't see lasting peace happening anytime in my lifetime. And frankly, I don't see it happening anytime in the near future, or even in the moderate future, the medium range future. The two sides are too far apart. There's been too much killing and too much hatred generated over the past 120 or so years of conflict, 140 years. I don't think a compromise is possible at the moment, and I don't see it emerging as possible in the coming decades.
Sometimes I feel like I've been in state of shock for the past 2 years, ever since the bloodshed began. I think most of us have. Actually, every morning, the first thing I do is check with my friends in Gaza if they are alive and how they survived another night under shelling. Even during the ceasefire, I check how many more have been killed. Every morning, I ask myself the same question: how can this be considered normal? I feel deep sadness, anger, helplessness, because I know how devastating war is for ordinary people. Yet the world continues to watch without acting, and that is what makes me angry, and what makes me fear about our future, about the future of this world.
Wars do not end when the fighting stops. They end when the stories we tell about them begin to change. Gaza is often discussed as a problem to be managed, a crisis to be contained, or a tragedy to be endured. But it is also a place where people continue to think, argue, hope, and imagine a future, even when that future feels distant. Understanding those not guarantee peace, but without understanding, peace is impossible. This was episode 1 of Frontlines and Backrooms. Our next episode, Echo Chamber, the Media and the Gaza War, drops December 28 at 8 p.m. GMT.